In one account of the first vision, the Lord told the young Joseph Smith that the everlasting covenant was broken. In Joseph's next vision, the angel Moroni paraphrased a passage from the book of Malachi. "I will reveal unto you the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. If it were not so, the whole earth would be utterly wasted." Finally, a few years after Joseph was martyred, his successor Brigham Young had a dream in which the prophet appeared and taught him that our Father in heaven organized the human family, but they are all disorganized and in great confusion. Along with restoring the church and the gospel, there was another problem that Joseph and Brigham had to set right. They felt called to restore the heavenly order of the human family. In a previous episode, we went over some of the different ways that Latter-day Saints have thought about the priesthood since the Restoration. One conception of the priesthood that was very important in the 19th century is called the cosmological priesthood. Now, the term cosmological priesthood wasn't used in the 19th century. I believe the term was coined by a current Latter-day Saint researcher named Jonathan Stapley. There's a link to his book on this topic in the description below. Joseph Smith and Brigham Young just used the term priesthood for this concept, but since priesthood has had broader meanings throughout history, that can cause confusion, hence cosmological priesthood. The other thing I want to clarify is that I'm going to try to simplify this idea as much as possible, perhaps to a fault. Even when it was the defining vision that guided the church, the cosmological priesthood was often poorly understood by Latter-day Saints. Different leaders often had different and sometimes contradictory ideas about exactly how to make sense of this concept, especially when it came down to the details. That said, I think there was a pretty clear logic at the heart of the cosmological priesthood that can be explained pretty simply. So what is it? Basically, Latter-day Saints were sealed together through marriages and adoptions into a hyper-connected extended family. This family, this intricate kinship network, was the priesthood, or in modern parlance, the cosmological priesthood. Latter-day Saints believed that this cosmological priesthood family was the kingdom of heaven in a very literal way. So belonging to this priesthood family, in some sense, was the same as being saved in the kingdom of heaven, and it guaranteed exaltation in the celestial kingdom. Hopefully that definition is pretty straightforward. To fully understand the implications of this idea, I want to walk through some of the ways it was developed and applied. In 1836, as per Moroni's promise, Joseph Smith had a vision of the prophet Elijah in the Kirtland Temple, who empowered him with the keys of sealing fathers and children in the cosmological priesthood. But it wasn't until the Nauvoo period that Joseph seemed to get serious about building this priesthood family. In Nauvoo, he initiated a small group of men and women into a matrix of temple rituals, including sealings. He taught that in order to obtain the highest exaltation, a man must enter into this order of the priesthood. In a public sermon, he counseled the saints to seal on earth your sons and daughters unto yourself, and yourself unto your fathers in eternal glory. Use a little craftiness and seal all you can. And when you get to heaven, tell your Father that what you seal on earth should be sealed in heaven. I will walk through the gate of heaven and claim what I seal and those that follow me. This hints at another important, if confusing, aspect of the cosmological priesthood. Not only was belonging to the order of the priesthood a requirement for exaltation, but it seemed to practically guarantee exaltation. In a revelation, the prophet taught that if someone who was sealed shall commit any sin or transgression of the new and everlasting covenant whatever, and all manner of blasphemies, if they commit no murder wherein they shed innocent blood, they shall enter into their exaltation. Theologians often call this sort of teaching perseverance, in the sense that grace or salvation perseveres despite the ordinary sins or backsliding of a saved individual. I think this teaching demonstrates how solemn and literal the sealing power was for Joseph, but it was always problematic for reasons that are probably pretty obvious. Latter-day Saints sometimes draw on this idea as a way to reassure parents of wayward children that their sealings guarantee that the children will be saved, and there are general conference talks even into the 21st century that express ideas along those lines. But various church leaders throughout church history have rejected this doctrine, at least in its most brazen formulations. Salvation in the cosmological priesthood was sometimes described in social terms. Joseph Smith taught that that same sociality which exists among us here will exist among us in heaven, only it will be coupled with eternal glory. In another sermon, he said, a little tongue-in-cheek, "Let me be resurrected with the saints, whether to heaven or hell, what do we care if the society is good?" The prophet loved the saints, and being with them constituted heaven. But this salvation was also described in what might be called political terms. In a revelation, the Lord promised Joseph, 100-fold in this world of fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, houses and lands, wives and children, and crowns of eternal lives in the eternal worlds. Beyond mere good company, priesthood kinship was also about dominion and government, a dimension of the priesthood that certainly seems a bit foreign today. Obviously, the most controversial part of the cosmological priesthood as it was lived in the 19th century was plural marriage and adoption. Plural marriage was the practice of sealing multiple women as wives to a single man, and adoption was the practice of sealing adult men as sons to another man, usually a church leader. Plural marriage was obviously more controversial, although adoption was apparently more difficult for the saints to wrap their heads around. Again, a huge amount has been said and written about these practices, so summing them up is guaranteed to be an oversimplification, but I'll still take a crack at it. I think we can best make sense of these practices within the context of two important ideas. The first is that exaltation was believed to be proportional to a person's connectedness or dominion within the priesthood. A man who presided over more descendants in the order of the priesthood would preside over a greater kingdom and glory in the next life. The second idea has to do with preserving the integrity of the priesthood chain. For most of the 19th century, for example, Latter-day Saints generally weren't sealed to their parents if their parents hadn't accepted the gospel in this life. Proxy ordinances for the dead were only believed to be efficacious if the spirits of the dead accepted them. And since exaltation depended on your connection to the cosmological priesthood, it seemed wildly imprudent to run your chain of sealings through relatives who may not even accept those sealings. By contrast, plural marriage and adoption allowed individuals to securely integrate themselves directly into the priesthood kinship network. When sealings were done for the dead, ancestors were usually connected by adoption or marriage either to living descendants or to church leaders. I also think there was a sense of urgency to complete the work of sealing the saints together before the second coming. Brigham Young, for example, taught that were we to wait to redeem our dead relatives before we could link the chain of the priesthood, we would never accomplish it. Plural marriage and adoption were the most convenient tools for this task. In 1890, under immense pressure from the United States federal government, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued a manifesto ending the practice of plural marriage. Then, at a general conference in 1894, Woodruff announced that he had received a revelation that would also end the practice of adoption. We have not fully carried out those principles in fulfillment of the revelations of God to us, in sealing the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. I was adopted to my father and should have had my father sealed to his father and so on back. Have children sealed to their parents and run this chain through as far as you can get it. This is the will of the Lord to this people. This decision really resonated with the spiritual intuitions of Latter-day Saints at the time, who never seemed entirely comfortable with the doctrine of adoption. But what about the integrity of the cosmological priesthood? There were two new doctrines that resolved that problem. First, Woodruff taught that among our deceased ancestors, there will be very few, if any, who will not accept the gospel. This universalism mitigated the risk of linking the saints to the priesthood through their kindred dead. Second, church leaders insisted that a just God would not cut faithful disciples out of exaltation due to circumstances outside of their control. It was presumed that gaps or confusions in the priesthood chain could be remedied either in the next life or during the millennial reign of Christ on earth. This was and continues to be an especially salient point for saints who are never able to marry in this life. And the rest is history. Well, I guess it's all history, but in the years since, the original logic of the cosmological priesthood has faded from Latter-day Saint discourse. And yet, members of the church today still dutifully perform priesthood sealings and teach that the sealing ordinance is a requirement for exaltation. Even if we're comfortable repudiating some of the practices and doctrines historically associated with the cosmological priesthood, the concept is still embedded in our liturgy. We'll tackle some of the theological opportunities and challenges this presents us with in a future episode here on Stupor of Thought.